The Legend of Zelda has always been a series about evolution. Ocarina of Time revolutionized gaming by proving 3D adventures could work on consoles. Majora's Mask took that engine and created something completely different, a game where time was a weapon and freedom was terrifying. Wind Waker didn't just introduce cell shading, it fundamentally changed how players interacted with the world through sailing and exploration. Twilight Princess went darker and grittier. Skyward Sword pushed storytelling boundaries within a linear framework. Each generation, Zelda didn't just improve on the previous formula, it challenged it. Zelda games broke conventions, took risks, and sometimes alienated players in service of pushing the medium forward. That willingness to reinvent was the series' defining characteristic. It's why Zelda remained culturally relevant for nearly 40 years, despite gaming evolving around it. But something shifted recently. Breath of the Wild was revolutionary, redefining open-world gaming fundamentally. But it raised a question. After you revolutionize a genre, what comes next? Tears of the Kingdom answered that question, and the answer was refinement. Polish, expand, add new mechanics, but keep the core structure largely intact. Today we're asking the uncomfortable question, is Zelda leaving its innovation era behind? Is the series transitioning from revolutionary reinvention to comfortable iteration? Are we entering an age where Zelda games are incredibly polished, universally beloved, and creatively conservative? Or is this just a natural pause before the next revolution? Let's explore what innovation meant for Zelda, and whether the series still has it in 2024 and beyond. The golden age of reinvention, when Zelda always broke the rules. To understand whether Zelda is leaving innovation behind, we need to remember what made Zelda special. The series wasn't known for perfecting established formulas. It was known for destroying them and building something new from the rashes. Ocarina of Time came out during the awkward adolescence of 3D gaming, when most developers were still learning how to make 3D work. Zelda didn't just make a 3D game, it fundamentally solved the problems that plagued early 3D adventures. The Z targeting system, the context-sensitive button, the camera solutions, these weren't incremental improvements, they were revolutionary solutions to unsolved problems. Ocarina proved that 3D adventure games could work, changing the trajectory of the entire industry. But here's what's remarkable. After proving Ocarina's formula worked, Nintendo immediately abandoned it. Majora's Mask used the same engine, but the design was radically different. Time became a constant, ticking threat rather than unlimited freedom. Link transformed into different forms that changed gameplay fundamentally. The world was smaller but denser. Majora's Mask was proof that just because you invented a formula doesn't mean you have to repeat it. This pattern continued. Wind Waker looked completely different from Ocarina and Majora, using cell shading when realistic graphics dominated. Instead of dungeons occupying physical spaces, dungeons were scattered across an ocean requiring sailing to reach. Instead of collecting items to progress, you collected parts to assemble them. Everything about Wind Waker was different from what came before, and many longtime fans hated it, but Nintendo committed to the vision anyway, creating a masterpiece that eventually won over its critics. The willingness to take critical risks in service of artistic vision defined the Zelda era. Breath of the Wild arrived in 2017 and did something unprecedented. It threw out 40 years of Zelda conventions and rebuilt the series from the ground up. No required progression, no essential items that gate content, dungeons in any order, combat that rewarded experimentation and creativity, an open world that didn't hold your hand. Breath of the Wild was revolutionary. It proved that open-world games didn't need to be bloated with markers and quest markers. It showed that freedom and challenge weren't mutually exclusive. It demonstrated that a beloved franchise could be completely reimagined and become more beloved in the process. In terms of pure innovation, Breath of the Wild was Zelda at its finest. But here's the uncomfortable reality. While Breath of the Wild was revolutionary for gaming broadly, it represented something different for Zelda specifically. Previous Zelda innovations came from within, new mechanics, new structures, new philosophies about how Zelda games should work. But Breath of the Wild's innovation was largely adopting and perfecting genre standards from elsewhere. The open-world structure, the emergent gameplay, the systems-driven design, these weren't invented by Zelda, they were proven formulas that Breath of the Wild perfected. This isn't a criticism of Breath of the Wild. Perfecting an existing formula at that level is itself a remarkable achievement. But it's different from Majora's Mask inventing time-based dungeons or Wind Waker creating sailing-based exploration. Breath of the Wild was Nintendo saying, we're going to make the best open world game possible, rather than we're going to invent a new form of adventure game. Additionally, Breath of the Wild achieved this innovation by abandoning traditional Zelda elements. Dungeons became miniaturized divine beasts that could be completed in any order without requiring items. The puzzle design shifted from acquire item, use item to solve dungeon, to figure out any solution that works. Item usage became optional rather than essential. The linear progression that defined Zelda for 4 decades became completely optional. This raises a crucial question. Was Breath of the Wild innovative for Zelda, or innovative for the game industry? Breath of the Wild convinced the industry that open-world design didn't require checklist markers and hand-holding. That's massive industry impact. But within Zelda's own history, it represented a departure from innovation towards adopting external conventions. Tears of the Kingdom faced an impossible task. How do you follow up the most successful Zelda game ever made? The answer Nintendo provided was through controlled iteration. TOTK isn't revolutionary. It uses BOTW's engine, BOTW's map, BOTW's core systems. Everything you know about how BOTW plays remains true in TOTK. What TOTK added was Ultra Hand and Fuse, mechanics that dramatically expand player creativity and freedom. These systems are genuinely impressive, offering tools for solutions no one anticipated. Building elaborate machines, creating elaborate combat strategies, fusing weapons with unexpected materials. These mechanics enable emergent gameplay that even BOTW didn't fully explore. But at its core, TOTK is fundamentally BOTW with addition rather than transformation. You climb the same mountains, solve physics puzzles with largely the same mechanics, navigate a familiar world. The core loop of explore, solve problems creatively, get resources, repeat, remains unchanged. The innovations are refinements on existing systems rather than revolutionary new directions. This represents a significant shift in philosophy. Previous Zelda sequels either expanded with new engines and mechanics, like Majora's Mask or Wind Waker, or created such different experiences that they felt like spiritual successors rather than direct sequels, like Twilight Princess or Skyward Sword. TOTK is the first Zelda game that's primarily an expansion of its predecessor, rather than a reinvention. Is this wrong? Not necessarily. Perfecting and expanding an already excellent formula is valuable. TOTK's creative tools enabled player expression that BOTW didn't fully support. The depths added an entirely new world to explore.
The Sky Islands expanded exploration vertically. These are substantial additions that justify the sequel's existence. But the questions linger. Where is the innovation beyond BOTW's framework? What new philosophy about adventure games is TOTK exploring? What conventions is it breaking? These questions don't have satisfying answers because TOTK isn't interested in those challenges. It's interested in perfecting what already works. The refinement trap, when iteration becomes convention. Here's what concerns some longtime players about the current Zelda direction. Iteration can be safer than innovation, but it can also be limiting. Once a formula becomes established and commercially successful, the pressure increases to protect that formula rather than risk it. Think about it from Nintendo's perspective. BOTW sold 31+ million copies. TOTK sold 20+ million copies in its first year. These aren't just successful games, they're the most successful Zelda games ever. The pressure to maintain this success is immense. An experimental new direction risks alienating the massive audience BOTW and TOTK created. It's easier and safer to iterate on proven formulas rather than risk player alienation on risky new directions. But this creates a trap. If Zelda continues iterating on open-world design, eventually the formula becomes stale. The third game in the open-world Zelda formula will feel like less substantial iteration than TOTK. The fourth will feel even more like refinement. Eventually, players begin to see Zelda not as innovative, but as comfortable, reliable, and creatively conservative. This happened to other franchises. Call of Duty revolutionized shooters, then spent over a decade refining that formula until fatigue set in. Grand Theft Auto created open-world crime games, then spent enormous effort perfecting minor refinements until GTA Online became a services game. Assassin's Creed pioneered a formula, then iterated it to death until players were exhausted. The risk isn't that Zelda becomes bad. BOTW and TOTK prove Nintendo can iterate expertly. The risk is that Zelda becomes predictable, that the series stops challenging gaming conventions and starts defending them instead. That Zelda becomes the franchise to turn to for polished, reliable experiences rather than bold artistic statements. The looming question, what's next? Looking ahead, the crucial question is, what comes after the open-world Zelda cycle? Will Nintendo do 3 open-world games, then something new? Will they continue iterating indefinitely? Will they attempt something genuinely revolutionary? There are tantalizing hints about possible directions. VR and AR technology could enable entirely new ways to explore Hyrule. Procedural generation could create infinite variations of the world. AI could enable NPCs with genuine agency and unpredictable behavior. Hybrid approaches, combining open-world freedom with structured dungeon design, could create entirely new structures. But here's the problem. Each of these directions is riskier than iterating on the successful BOTW formula. VR Zelda could alienate players without VR headsets. Procedurally generated Hyrule loses the carefully crafted world building that makes the setting meaningful. AI-driven NPCs are unpredictable and could break narrative beats. Hybrid designs might satisfy nobody, trying to be both structured and open without fully committing to either. Innovation requires risk, and the bigger the innovation, the bigger the risk. Nintendo successfully took risks with Majora's Mask, Wind Waker, and Skyward Sword because those games were smaller scale than BOTW and TOTK. With 31+ million BOTW players expecting continuation, the stakes are infinitely higher. Taking a radical risk now means alienating a massive audience if it doesn't work. This creates the paradox of innovation. Success makes innovation harder. The bigger your audience, the more careful you must be. The more successful a formula, the more pressure exists to protect it. Zelda's success actually constrains future innovation by raising the bar so high that anything risky feels dangerous. Beyond Hyrule, redefining innovation. Perhaps the real question isn't whether Zelda is leaving innovation behind, but whether our definition of innovation needs updating. For decades, innovation meant do something we haven't done before. By that metric, Zelda has done a lot, and the low-hanging fruit for truly novel mechanics is getting picked. But there's another definition of innovation, doing something exceedingly well in ways that change perceptions about what's possible. By this metric, BOTW was incredibly innovative, not because it invented open-world design, but because it perfected it in ways others hadn't achieved. It innovated not through novelty, but through excellence. By this definition, TOTK continues the innovation. The building and fusion systems are complex enough and integrated thoroughly enough that they represent new possibilities for how games can empower player creativity. The core systems are proven, but the depth of possible interactions is genuinely novel. Other long-running franchises have found ways to balance tradition with innovation by moving beyond novelty seeking. Dark Souls didn't invent difficulty in games, but it made difficulty meaningful in unprecedented ways. Halo didn't invent sci-fi shooters, but it proved that careful balance between systems could create magic. The best franchises innovate through excellence rather than novelty. If Zelda shifts toward this philosophy, perfecting formulas and finding excellence within established structures, that's not leaving innovation behind, it's redefining what innovation means. But it does represent a philosophical shift from break conventions to master convention.
The risk of playing it safe. The genuine concern isn't that Zelda will continue doing open-world games, it's that Zelda might become afraid to do anything substantially different ever again.
If every future Zelda game is compared to BOTW and TOTK, and if deviating significantly is seen as risky, then the series truly would lose its identity as a place where boundaries are pushed. Historical precedent is instructive. When franchises stop taking risks, they don't immediately fail. They continue succeeding, coasting on reputation and familiar formulas. But gradually, the vitality fades. Players stop expecting revolution and settle for competence. The franchise becomes reliable rather than exciting. Skyward Sword was a risk that didn't fully pay off commercially, despite critical appreciation, but it proved Nintendo was willing to try something different even after creating a beloved formula. If we never see another directional risk from Zelda, if every game from here on out is an open-world refinement or a return to greatest hits design, then something essential about Zelda will have been lost. The willingness to risk alienating longtime fans in service of creative vision is what made Zelda special. Wind Waker looked nothing like Ocarina, and many fans hated it, but Nintendo committed to the vision anyway. If that willingness disappears, Zelda becomes a different series, still excellent, still beloved, but fundamentally changed. What Zelda could learn from its own history. Looking at what made previous Zelda innovations succeed offers a roadmap for future risk-taking. First, commit fully to the vision. Don't hedge bets or include features for everyone. Majora's Mask was weird and intimidating. That's what made it special. Wind Waker was visually distinct. That's what made it memorable. Twilight Princess's wolf form wasn't optional. It drove the entire design. Second, respect player intelligence. Don't explain everything explicitly. Let players discover mechanics, learn systems organically, figure things out. This requires trusting players and providing clear systems even when the game doesn't explain them. This is the opposite of modern game design that over-tutorializes everything. Third, iterate internally, not externally. Before BOTW, Zelda innovations came from Nintendo redefining what Zelda could be. After BOTW, innovations largely came from adopting proven industry techniques. Zelda needs to find new directions by asking, what can only Zelda do, rather than what are other successful games doing? Fourth, embrace failure as learning. Previous radical Zelda games sometimes failed commercially or critically initially, but Nintendo persisted because they believed in the vision. Accepting that not every risky game will be immediately beloved is necessary for continued innovation. The conclusion, innovation requires courage. Is Zelda leaving its innovation era behind? The evidence is mixed. BOTW proved Nintendo could still revolutionize when necessary. TOTK proved Nintendo could execute iteratively at the highest level. But TOTK's reception, overwhelmingly positive but notably less revolutionary than BOTW, suggests the series might be transitioning from revolutionary to reliable. The series' future depends on Nintendo's willingness to take risks. Not every Zelda game needs to be revolutionary, but a series called The Legend of Zelda shouldn't abandon its legacy of pushing boundaries and challenging conventions. The franchise was built on reinvention, on the principle that breaking the rules was preferable to perfecting them. Zelda can absolutely succeed by perfecting open-world design, iterating on proven formulas, and delivering polished experiences. That's not leaving innovation behind. That's finding a different form of innovation. But it's a different series from the one that challenged conventions and pushed gaming boundaries for 40 years. The real question isn't whether Zelda will innovate in the future, it's whether Nintendo will be brave enough to take risks that might alienate the massive audience that BOTW and TOTK built. Because innovation without risk isn't innovation, it's optimization. And while optimization is valuable, it's not what made Zelda legendary. The series that gave us Majora's Mask, Wind Waker, and Twilight Princess, games that were controversial, that took genuine risks, and challenged both players and industry conventions, has the capability for future revolution. Whether it has the courage is the real question. The innovation era isn't necessarily behind Zelda. It might just be taking a break, waiting for Nintendo to decide whether protecting a billion-dollar franchise is more important than pushing it towards something genuinely new.
That's the choice Nintendo faces, and that choice will determine whether Zelda remains a series about breaking boundaries or becomes a series about perfecting them.